Part of electracy is an ongoing process by which we're rethinking our attitude towards a lot of things that have gone on in the 19th and 20th century. This is the grammatological frame, that is, when you're looking at the history of the 19th and 20th centuries from the point of view of the apparatus, where you're thinking about photography and those technological inventions as being part of the emerging of a new apparatus, which is being understood by analogy with what we know historically about the emergence of literacy in classical Greece and other civilizations around the world. Then some things that happened look somewhat differently. For example, the whole idea of the avant-garde, which turned away from conceptual thinking, from the abstractions of positivism in the 19th, 20th centuries. They were doing it for their own reasons, a certain disquiet, a certain, even in the 20th century, a certain disgust with Western civilization because of the wars and other things. Those were the motivations within modernism itself, but the whole movement of primitivism is understood somewhat differently within electracy than it's understood in its own terms in the art community. Because what a lot of artists did was when they turned away from conceptual thinking and those kinds of abstractions of positivism, they didn't just try to invent somehow out of pure fantasy an alternative, but rather they looked to non-Western civilizations. They looked to the apparatus of civilizations other than those organized by modern science. So, so as we know, there was an interest in China and Japan, the islands, Africa, Native Americans, and all of these other oral or kinds of apparatuses. And there's something about that in electracy where we learn from primitivism, learn from other civilizations, understood now as being different kinds of ways of organizing memory and of language. So, for example, when we're talking about moving through, drifting through the zone, walking, whether that's a drift or a situation in a topological sense, moving through a space, something like the Aboriginal Dreamtime is a very good model for what we're trying to do. To find a digital equivalent, we can learn from the way the Aborigines mapped fully their cosmology and their mythology onto the landscape in which they lived. And as nomads, they would do their walkabouts, or they would do their tours of their space. And their memory system was that as they came to each of their sacred spots, the wise man or woman would tell the tales, tell the stories that were cued or triggered by the landscape in that particular place. And so as they moved through the seasons, moved through their space, there was a kind of a cognitive map or an allegory or a mystery that was formed, a collective story in which the culture and civilization and the landscape that the people moved through were one and the same. Well, in a way, that's a very good analogy for what we're trying to do now in choral space, online, digital memory, is to have movement through a space be an act of reasoning by which a person could think about and understand and reason about problems and the world. There's, of course, another model for this, again, that we are looking at and learning from. We call these relays. A relay is not exactly a model. A model is something that you take over whole cloth and just try to repeat it. But what a relay does is it gives you an idea of a direction that you want to go in. You don't want to replicate the thing completely, but you want to learn from it in order to do your own thing. Well, another relay for the Cora is mnemonic memory systems, and especially medieval culture, manuscript culture, from the Romans through to the beginning of print. The way schooling worked in church schools and universities in Europe at that time was that students were trained in memory, and you built a memory theater in order to be able to perform, give speeches. That's the way performance was measured. That were the practices of schooling and of learning in a manuscript culture were not writing, but they were speaking. You had to be able to speak. You had to be able to argue, debate, persuade, and you had to hold forth without writing for hours at a time sometimes. Well, how did you do this? Well, you developed a memory system, and this memory theater system is extremely interesting as a relay for us, because the way it works is very mystorical, or it's very allegorical. It's a structure, it's a cognitive map, really, because the base or the ground for the memory system is an image of one's own most familiar hometown, maybe the main street of one's hometown, or just the yard and house of one's home that one grew up in, or one's present home. Anyway, some space is very familiar, and that's the base of the memory system, and that provides the place. We would say the cora for the memory, and then through that space, at regular intervals, in specific significant places that are charged with emotion or charged with feeling, one places significant images, striking images, and these images may not be associated specifically with that place in any way, and not be motivated by anything to do with that place, but just would be a very strong image that would then be the cue for the information, for the data that one is memorizing. And then the data that one is memorizing may be anything. It would be all the writings of Cicero. It would be all the commentaries on the Bible by the church fathers, or any body of information at all. And then a person can call upon that body of information as needed by going to the place. And literally the way the practice worked then was in one's memory, one would walk through the space and go to the place where one had put that particular speech by Cicero, and that there would be an image there that would cue, be kind of a symbolic image loaded with allegorical devices that would cue and trigger the different parts of the speech, and then one would then recover the speech and use some part of it, maybe as a citation to persuade or to argue in a debate. Now, of course, that was all internalized. I mean, there's a famous case that's been written about Matteo Ricci, who was a Jesuit church father. The Jesuits kept this memory system going longer than almost anyone. Matteo Ricci was a missionary in China, and he was so good at this memory system that when he became fluent in Chinese, he challenged one of the ways that he got the Chinese interested in Christianity was by his power of memory, because they had a state system of exams and so forth. They really needed memory. It was extremely important to the Chinese learned class as well. So they respected people with good memories. And Matteo Ricci had one of the best memories probably in history. And he impressed them by, he'd say, look, make among you all, let's make 500 Chinese characters that I don't know, right? So, and I'll memorize them in 2 hours. And so they would make these characters, these ideograms, or these kanji, or whatever they call them in China. And they didn't think this would be possible. And he would memorize these 500 characters in 2 hours, just using his memory system. So it was very powerful. Well, what we like about the idea of the prosthesis, of course, is that you and I don't have to internalize these things, but that we can use the image of the Miami River as the base place that is loaded, that has a certain number of these loaded, these sites loaded with emotion. We can use the characters that we've encountered, Simon Lubin, Frank Peon,